Hello readers, welcome back to Reads with Rune B. Today we will be reading chapter 3 of our new read, Peter Pan. As always, I need to make our readers aware that all proceeds from these videos, if any, will go directly to Greater Ormond Street Children's Hospital. If you, dear reader, would like to donate yourselves, I will include a link in this video's description and at the top of the comments section. That being said, I hope you're comfortable and let's get reading. Chapter 3, Come Away. For one moment after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the night lights by the beds of the three children continued to burn clearly. They were awful nice little night lights, and one cannot help but wishing that they could have kept awake to see Peter. But Wendy's light blinked and gave such a yawn that the other two yawned also, and before they could close their mouths, all three went out. There was another light in the room now, a thousand times brighter than the night lights, and the time we have taken to say this, it had been through all the drawers in the nursery looking for Peter's shadow, rummaged through the wardrobe and turned every pocket inside out. It was not really a light. It made this light by flashing about so quickly. But when it came to rest for a second, you saw it was a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still growing. It was a girl called Tinkerbell, exquisitely gowned in a skeleton leaf, cut low and square, through which her figure could be seen to its best advantage, and she slightly inclined in bottom point. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of little stars, and Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinkerbell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with the fairy dust. "Tinkerbell," he called softly, making sure the children were asleep. "Tink, where are you?" She was in a jug for the moment, and liking it extremely, for she had never been in a jug before. "Oh, do come out of the jug and tell me. Do you know where they put my shadow?" The loveliest tinkle of golden bells answered him. It was the fairy language. You ordinary children can never hear it, but if you were to hear it, you would know that you had once heard it before. Tink said the shadow was in the big box. She meant the chest of drawers. Peter jumped at the drawer, scattering their contents to the floor with both hands, as kings tossed halfpence to the crowd. In a moment he recovered his shadow, and in his delight he forgot that he had shut up Tinkerbell into the drawer. If he had thought at all, and I don't believe he ever thought, it was that he and his shadow, when brought near to each other, would join like drops of water, and when they did not, he was appalled. He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but that also failed. A shudder passed through Peter, and he sat on the floor and cried. His sobs soon woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. She was not alarmed at seeing a stranger crying on the nursery floor. She was only pleasantly interested. "Boy," she said courteously, "why are you crying?" Peter could be exceedingly polite also, having learned the grand manner at the fairy ceremonies, and he rose and bowed to her beautifully. She was much pleased, and bowed beautifully to him from the end of the bed. "What is your name?" he asked. "Wendy Myra Angela Darling," she replied with some satisfaction. "And what is your name?" "Peter Pan." She was already sure that he must be Peter Pan, but it did seem a comparatively short name. Is that all? Yes, he said rather sharply. He felt for the first time that it was a shortish name. I'm so sorry, said Wendy Myra Angela. It doesn't matter, Peter gulped. She asked where he lived. Second to the right, Peter said, and straight on till morning. What a funny address. Peter had a sinking. And for the first time he felt that perhaps it was a funny address. No, it isn't, he said. I mean, Wendy said nicely, remembering that she was a hostess. Is that what they put on the letters? He wished she had not mentioned letters. Don't get any letters, he said contemptuously. But your mother gets letters. Don't have a mother, he said. Not only had he had no mother, but he had not the slightest desire in having one. He thought them very overrated persons. Wendy, however, felt at once that she was in the presence of great tragedy. Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying, she said, and got out of bed and ran to him. I wasn't crying about mothers, he said indignantly. I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying. Has it come off? Yes. Wendy then saw the shadow on the floor, looking so draggled, and she was frightfully sorry for Peter. How awful, she said, but she could not help but smiling when she saw that he had been trying to stick it on with soap. How exactly like a boy. She knew at once what to do. It must be sewn on, she said patronizingly. But only a little. So, he asked, you're dreadfully ignorant. No, I'm not. But she was exulting in his ignorance. I shall sew it on for you, my little man, she said. Though he was as tall as herself, she got out her housewife and sewed the shadow to Peter's foot. I dare say it will hurt a little. Oh, I shan't cry, said Peter, who was already of the opinion that he had never cried in his life, and he clenched his teeth and did not cry, and soon his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased. Perhaps I should have ironed it, said Wendy thoughtfully, but Peter, boylike, was indifferent to appearances, and he was now jumping about with the wildest of glee. Alas, he had already forgotten that he owed his bliss to Wendy. He had thought he had attached the shadow himself. How clever I am, he cried rapturously. Oh, the cleverness of me. It is humiliating to have to confess that this conceit of Peter was one of his most fascinating qualities. To put it with brutal frankness, there was never a cockier boy. But for the moment, Wendy was shocked. You conceit, she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. Of course I did nothing. You did a little, Peter said carelessly, and continued to dance. A little, she replied with hauteur. If I am no use, I can at least withdraw. And she sprang into the most dignified way into bed and covered up her face with blankets. To induce her to look up, he pretended to be going away, and when this failed, he sat on the end of the bed and tapped her gently with his foot. Wendy, he said, don't withdraw. I can't help crying, Wendy, when I am so pleased with myself. She still would not look up, although she was listening eagerly. Wendy, he continued, in a voice that no woman yet had ever been able to resist. Wendy, one girl is more use than 20 boys. Now Wendy was every inch the woman, and though there were not many inches, she peeped out of the bedclothes. Do you really think so, Peter? Yes, I do. I think it's perfectly sweet of you, she declared. I'll get up again. And with that, she sat with him on the bed on the side of the bed. She also said she would give him a kiss if he liked. But Peter did not know what she meant, and held out his hand expectantly. Surely you know what a kiss is, she asked, aghast. I shall know when you give it to me, he replied stiffly. And not to hurt his feelings, she gave him a thimble. And now, he said, I shall give you a kiss? She replied with a slight primness, if you please, and made herself rather cheap by inclining her face towards him, but he merely dropped an acorn button into her hand, so she slowly returned her face to where it had been before, and said nicely that she would wear his kiss on a chain around her neck. It was lucky that she did put it on a chain, for it was afterwards to save her life. When people in our set are introduced, it is customary for them to ask each other's ages. And so Wendy, who liked to do things correctly, asked Peter how old he was. It was not really a happy question to ask him. It was rather like an examination paper that asks grammar, and then what you want to be asked is Kings of England. I don't know, he replied uneasily, but I am quite young. He really knew nothing about it. He really had suspicions. But he said at adventure, Wendy, I ran away the day I was born. Wendy was quite surprised, but she was interested, and indicated in a charming drawing-room manner by the touch on her nightgown that he could sit nearer to her. Because I heard father and mother, he explained in a low voice, talking about what I was to be when I would become a man. He was extraordinarily agitated now. I don't ever want to be a man, he said with a passion. I always want to be a little boy and to have fun. So I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived a long, long time among the fairies. She gave him a look of the most intense admiration, and he thought it was because he had run away, but it was really because he knew fairies. Wendy had lived in such a home that to know fairies struck her as quite delightful. She poured out questions about them, and to his surprise, she poured out questions about him about them. To his surprise, for they were rather a nuisance to him, getting in his way and so on, and indeed sometimes he had to give them a hiding. Still, he liked them on the whole, and he told her about the beginning of fairies. You see, Wendy, when the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about, and that was the beginning of fairies. Tedious talk this, but being a stay-at-home, Tedious talk this, but being a stay-at-home, she liked it. And so, he went on good-naturedly, there ought to be one fairy for every boy and every girl. Ought to be, isn't there? No, you see, children know such a lot now, they soon don't believe in fairies, and every time a child says, I don't believe in fairies, there is a fairy somewhere that falls down dead. He really thought they had talked enough about fairies, and it struck him that Tinker Bell was keeping very quiet. I can't think to where she has gone, he said, rising, as he called Tink by name. Wendy's heart went into a flutter and sudden thrill. Peter, she cried, clutching him, you don't mean to tell me that there is a fairy in the room? She was here just now, he said a little impatiently. You hear her, don't you? The only sound I hear is like a little tinkling of bells. Well, that's Chink. That's the fairy language. I think I hear her too. The sound came from the chest of drawers. Peter made a merry face. No one could ever look quite so merry as Peter. And the loveliest of gurgles was his laugh. And he had his first laugh still. Wendy, he whispered gleefully, I do believe I shut her up in the drawer. He let poor Tink out of the drawer, and she flew about the nursery, screaming with fury. You shouldn't say such things, Peter retorted. Of course I'm very sorry, but how could I have known you were in the drawer? Wendy was not listening to him. Oh, Peter, she cried, if only she would stand still and let me see her. They hardly ever stand still, said Peter, but for one moment when Wendy saw a romantic figure come to rest on the cuckoo clock. Oh, the lovely, she cried, though Tink's face was still distorted with passion. Tink, said Peter amiably, this lady wishes you were her fairy. Tinkerbell answered insolently. What does she say, Peter? He had to translate. She's not very polite. She says you are a great ugly girl, and that she is my fairy. He tried to argue with Tink. You know you can't be my fairy, Tink, because I'm a gentleman and you are a lady. To this, Tink replied in these words, you silly ass, and disappeared into the bathroom. She is quite a common fairy, Peter explained apologetically. She is called Tinkerbell because she mends the pots and kettles. They were together in the armchair by this time, and Wendy piled him with more questions. If you don't live in Kensington Gardens now, sometimes I still do, but where do you live mostly now? With the Lost Boys. Who are they? They are children who fell out of their perambulators when the nurses were looking the other way. If they are not claimed in 7 days, they are sent away to Neverland to defray expenses. I am captain. What fun it must be. Yes, said cunning Peter, but we are rather lonely, you see, for we have no female companionship. Are none of the others girls? Oh no, girls, you know, are much too clever to fall out of their prams. This fluttered Wendy immensely. I think, she said, it is perfectly lovely the way you talk about girls. John there just despises us. For reply, Peter rose and kicked John out of bed, blankets and all. One kick. This seemed to Wendy rather forward for a first meeting, and she told him with spirit that he was not captain in her house. However, John continued to sleep so placidly on the floor that she allowed him to remain there. And I know you always mean to be kind, she said, relenting, so you may give me a kiss. For the moment, she had forgotten his ignorance about kisses. I thought you would want it back, he said, a little bitterly, and offered to return her the thimble. Oh dear, said the nice Wendy. I don't mean a kiss, I mean a thimble. What? Like this. She kissed him. Funny, said Peter gravely. Now shall I give you with a thimble? If you wish, said Wendy, keeping her head erect this time. Peter thimbled her, and almost immediately she screeched. What is it, Wendy? It's exactly as if someone were pulling my hair. That must have been Tink. I never knew her to be so naughty before. And indeed, Tink was darting about again, using offensive language. She says that she will do that to you, Wendy, every time I give you the thimble. But why? Why, Tink? Tink replied, you silly ass. Peter could not understand why, but Wendy understood. She was just slightly disappointed when he admitted that he had come to the nursery window not to see her, but to listen to stories. You see, I don't know any stories. None of the Lost Boys know stories. How perfectly awful, said Wendy. Do you know, Peter asked, why swallows build nests in the eaves of the houses? It's to listen to the stories. Oh, Wendy, your mother has been telling you such a lovely story. Which story is it? About the prince who couldn't find the lady who wore the glass slipper. Peter, Wendy said excitedly. That was Cinderella, and he found her, and they lived happily ever after. Peter was so glad that he rose from the floor where they had been sitting and hurried to the window. "Where are you going?" she cried with misgivings. "To tell the lost boys." "Don't go, Peter," she entreated. "I know lots of stories. Ever so many." Those were her precise words, so there can be no denying that it was she who tempted him first. He came back, and there was a greedy look in his eyes now which ought to have alarmed her, but did not. "Oh, the stories I could tell to all the boys," she cried, and Peter gripped her and began to draw her towards the window. "Let me go," she ordered him. "Wendy, do come with me and tell the stories to the other boys." Of course, she was ever so pleased to be asked, but she said, "Oh dear, I can't. Think of Mummy. Besides, I can't fly." "I'll teach you." "Oh, how lovely to fly. I'll teach you how to jump on the wind's back, and then away we'll go." "Oh," she exclaimed rapturously. Wendy, when you are sleeping in your silly bed, you might be flying about with me saying funny things to the stars." "Oh, and Wendy, there are mermaids." "Mermaids with tails? Such long tails. Oh," cried Wendy, "to see a mermaid." He had become frightfully cunning. "Wendy," he said, how we should all respect you." She was wringing her body in distress. It was quite as if she were trying to remain on the nursery floor, but he had no pity for her. "Wendy," he said, the sly one, "if you could tuck us in at night." "Ooh, none of us has ever been tucked in." "Oh," and her arms went out to him. "And you could darn our clothes and make pockets for us. None of us has any pockets." How could she resist? "Of course, it's awfully fascinating," she cried. "Peter, would you teach John and Michael to fly too?" "If you like," he said indifferently. And she ran to John and Michael and shook them. "Wake up! Peter Pan has come, and he's going to teach us how to fly." John rubbed his eyes. "Then I shall get up," he said, and of course he was on the floor already. "Hello, I'm up." Michael was up by this time also, and looking as sharp as a knife with 6 blades and a saw, but Peter suddenly signed their silence. Their faces assumed the awful craftiness of children listening for sounds of the grown-up world. All was still as salt, and then everything was right. No, stop, everything was wrong. Nana, who had been barking distressfully all evening, was all quiet now. It was her silence they had heard. "Out with the light! Hide, quick!" cried John, taking command for only the first time throughout the whole adventure. Thus, when Liza entered, holding Nana, the nursery seemed quite its old self. Very dark, and you would have sworn that you heard its 3 wicked inmates breathing angelically as they slept. They were doing it so artfully from behind the window curtains. Liza was in a bad temper, for she was mixing up the Christmas puddings in the kitchen and had been drawn away from them, with raisins still on her cheek, by Nana's absurd suspicions. She thought the best way of getting a little quiet was to take Nana to the nursery for a moment, but in custody, of course. "There, you suspicious brute," she said, not sorry that Nana was in disgrace. "They are perfectly safe, aren't they? Every one of the little angels sound asleep in bed. And listen to their gentle breathing." Here Michael, encouraged by his success, breathed so lowly that they were nearly detected. Nana knew that kind of breathing. She tried to drag herself out of Liza's clutches, but Liza was dense. "No more of it, Nana," she said sternly, pulling her out of the room. "If you wish to bark again, I shall go straight for the master and missus and bring them home for the party. And then, oh, won't the master whip you just!" She tied the unhappy dog up again. "But do you think Nana's ceased to bark?" "Bring the master and missus home from the party. Why, that was just what she wanted. Do you think she cared that she was whipped so long for so long as her charges were safe. Unfortunately, Liza returned to her puddings, and Nana, seeing no help would come from her, strained and strained at the chain until at last she broke it, and in another moment she had burst into the dining room of 27 and flung her paws up heavenward, her most expressive way of making a communication. Mr. and Mrs. Darling knew at once something terrible was happening in their nursery, and without a good-bye to their hostess they rushed into the street. But now it was 10 minutes since the three scoundrels had been breathing behind the curtains. Peter Pan can do a great deal in 10 minutes. We now return to the nursery. "It's all right," John announced, emerging from his hiding place. "I say, Peter, can you really fly?" And instead of troubling him to answer, Peter flew around the room, taking to the mantelpiece on the way. "How topping," said John and Michael. "How sweet," cried Wendy. "Yes, I'm sweet. Oh, I am sweet," said Peter, forgetting his manners. It looked delightfully easy, and they tried it from the floor and then from their beds, but always went down instead of up. "I say, how do you do it?" asked John, rubbing at his knee, for he was quite a practical boy. "You think lovely, wonderful thoughts," said Peter, "and they lift you into the air." He showed them again. "You're so nippy at it. Couldn't you do it once, very slowly?" Peter did it both slowly and quickly. "I've got it now, Wendy," cried John, but soon he found he had not. Not one of them could fly an inch. Even Michael was in 2 words of a syllable, and Peter did not know A from Z, and of course Peter had been trifling with them, for no one can fly unless fairy dust has been blown on him. Unfortunately, as we mentioned, one of his hands was very messy with it, and he blew some on each of them, with the most superb results. "Now wiggle your shoulders this way," he said, "and let go." And they were all on their beds, and gallant Michael let go first. He did not quite need to let go, but he did it, and immediately he was borne across the room. "I flew," he screamed, while still in midair. John let go and met Wendy near the bathroom. "Oh, how lovely! Oh, how ripping! Look at me! Look at me! Look at me!" They were not nearly so elegant as Peter, and could not help kicking a little, but their heads were bobbing against the ceiling, and there was almost nothing so delicious as that. Peter gave Wendy a hand at first, but then had to desist. Tink was so indignant. Up and down they went, round and round. Heavenly was Wendy's word. "I say," cried John, "why shouldn't we all go out?" And of course this was what Peter had been luring them to. Michael was ready. He wanted to see how long it took him to do 1,000,000,000 miles. But Wendy hesitated. "Mermaids," said Peter again. "Oh, and there are pirates." "Pirates!" cried John, seizing his Sunday hat. "Let us go at once." It was just this moment that Mr. and Mrs. Darling hurried with Nana out of number 27. They ran into the middle of the street and looked up at the nursery window, and yes, it was still shut, but the room was ablaze with light, and the most heart-gripping sight of all, they could see in the shadow of the curtains 3 little figures in night attire circling round and round, not on the floor, but in the air. Not 3 figures, 4. In a tremble they opened the street door. Mr. Darling would have rushed upstairs, but Miss Darling signed to him to go softly. She even tried to make her heart go softly. Will they reach the nursery in time? If so, how delightful for them, for we shall all breathe a sigh of relief. But then there will be no story. On the other hand, if they are not in time, I solemnly promise that it will all come all right in the end. They would have reached the nursery in time had it not been for the little stars that were watching them. Once again, the stars blew open the window, and the smallest stars all called out, "Cave, Peter!" And then Peter knew there was not a moment to lose. "Come," he cried imperiously, and soared out into the night, followed by John and Michael and Wendy. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana rushed into the nursery. Too late. The little birds were flown. And that is the end of chapter 3. I hope you join us for our next chapter. Until next time, keep reading, readers. Be safe. Be excellent. Bye for now.